What would you do if your elderly mother called you in tears because she was humiliated and kicked out of a restaurant? Most people would be angry. Some might complain online or leave bad reviews. But what if you had the power to do something that would change everything? Dorothy Mitchell thought she was just having the worst night of her life when the manager of the Golden Palace restaurant decided she wasn't worthy of eating there. At 78 years old, she had been looking forward to her annual tradition of dining at the same table where her late husband had proposed 50 years ago. Instead, she found herself standing in the rain, counting $20 bills while a cruel manager told her she belonged at Denny's. But Dorothy's son Michael wasn't just any concerned family member. And the Golden Palace wasn't just any restaurant. Sometimes the person you decide to humiliate has connections you never could have imagined. Sometimes your worst decision becomes someone else's perfect opportunity for justice. What happened next would destroy careers, close businesses, and prove that karma doesn't just exist in fairy tales. The arrogant manager who thought he could judge people by their appearance was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. This is the story of how one phone call from a heartbroken mother set in motion events that would bring down an entire restaurant and teach everyone involved that you never know who you're really dealing with. The rain hammered against the windows of the Golden Palace as Dorothy Mitchell clutched her worn leather purse closer to her chest. At 78 years old, she had learned to navigate the world with quiet dignity, but tonight felt different. Tonight carried the weight of 50 years of memories. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, her modest brown coat dripping slightly from the October downpour. The restaurant's interior blazed with golden chandeliers and marble floors that reflected the warm light like scattered diamonds. White tablecloths stretched across dozens of tables, each adorned with fresh orchids and gleaming silverware that probably cost more than Dorothy's monthly Social Security check. Dorothy paused at the entrance, taking in the familiar sight. This place had changed over the decades, grown more extravagant, more expensive, but it remained the same restaurant where Harold had proposed to her on this exact date in 1973. Every year since his death 3 years ago, she came here alone to honor their tradition. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice cut through her memories like a blade. Ben Rodriguez stood before her, his perfectly pressed black suit and slicked back hair, giving him the appearance of someone who had never known a day of struggle. At 42, he had worked his way up to manager of the Golden Palace through a combination of charm and ruthlessness that served him well in the upscale dining world. His eyes swept over Dorothy's appearance with the practiced efficiency of a bouncer. The brown coat, though clean, showed its age in the worn spots around the pockets. Her sensible black shoes had been resoled twice. Her gray hair was neatly styled, but clearly done at home rather than at the salon where most of his clientele spent hundreds on their weekly appointments. "Can I help you?" Ben's tone carried the false politeness of someone who had already made his decision. Dorothy straightened her shoulders. "I'd like a table for one, please. I have a reservation under Mitchell." Ben's eyebrows rose slightly. He walked to the hostess stand and ran his finger down the reservation book, though his movements were theatrical rather than thorough. "I'm not seeing anything under Mitchell for tonight. I called yesterday morning," Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I spoke with a young woman who confirmed my 7 o'clock reservation. Yesterday was Sunday," Ben replied with a condescending smile. "We don't take reservations on Sundays." Dorothy felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had called on Saturday, she was certain of it. But arguing would only make things worse. "Well, perhaps I could have a table without a reservation." "I don't mind waiting." Ben glanced around the restaurant. Several tables sat empty, their white cloths pristine and ready for guests. A couple in their 30s laughed over wine at a corner table, the woman's designer handbag casually placed on the table worth more than Dorothy's car. An elderly man in an expensive suit dined alone near the window, reading a newspaper between bites of what looked like lobster. "I'm afraid we're completely booked tonight," Ben said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at Denny's down the street." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Around them, conversations quieted as other diners began to notice the exchange. She felt their eyes on her, evaluating her the same way Ben had, finding her lacking. Amanda Foster approached from across the dining room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. At 35, she had been head waitress at the Golden Palace for 8 years, long enough to know exactly what was happening and experienced enough to know which side of the situation would benefit her career. "Is there a problem here?" Amanda asked, though her tone made it clear she already knew the answer. This lady seems to be lost, Ben said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest tables to hear. I was explaining that we might not be the right fit for her this evening. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she opened her purse. I have money, she said quietly, pulling out a small roll of $20 bills. I've been saving for this dinner all month. The sight of the modest bills seemed to amuse Ben further. Ma'am, our entrees start at $65. Our wine list begins at $40 a glass. This is a five-star establishment. I understand that, Dorothy replied, her voice growing stronger. My husband and I used to come here every year. We had our first date here in 1971. Well, things change, Amanda interjected with a sharp smile. The clientele has certainly evolved since then. Dorothy looked around the restaurant again, noticing details she had missed in her initial nostalgic haze. Every patron wore clothing that screamed wealth. Designer watches caught the light from wrists that had never known manual labor. Conversations drifted over about stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Look, Ben said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I'm trying to save you from embarrassment here. You walk in here dressed like you're going to the grocery store, counting out 20s like you're buying a Happy Meal. This isn't that kind of place. What kind of place is it exactly? Dorothy asked, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Ben's smile turned cruel. The kind where people belong, where they understand the standards, where they don't need to count their money before ordering. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the kitchen sound seemed muted as staff and patrons alike tuned into the drama unfolding at the front of the house. Dorothy felt exposed under their collective gaze, like an animal in a zoo being studied by curious visitors. I think you should leave, Amanda said, stepping closer, before this becomes more uncomfortable for everyone involved. Dorothy's mind raced back to all the times she and Harold had sat in this very restaurant. Harold in his one good suit, her in her best dress that she wore to church on Sundays. They had never been wealthy, but they had always been treated with respect. Harold would order the steak, she would get the salmon, and they would split a piece of chocolate cake while he told her about his dreams of retiring to a small house by the lake. Harold proposed to me at table 12, Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. October 15th, 1973. He was so nervous he knocked over his water glass. Ben rolled his eyes. That's a lovely story, but it doesn't change the situation. You don't belong here anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Dorothy felt them settle into her bones, joining decades of small slights and casual dismissals that came with being an elderly woman in a world that valued youth and wealth above all else. Fine, she said, closing her purse with shaking hands. I understand, but Ben wasn't finished. Perhaps it was the audience, or maybe it was the way Dorothy's quiet dignity irritated him, but he decided to drive the point home. You know what the real problem is, he said, his voice rising slightly. People like you think you can just waltz into places like this because of some story from 50 years ago. But times change. Standards change. We can't have every person who wanders in off the street thinking they can afford to eat here. Amanda nodded in agreement. It's about maintaining the atmosphere our real customers expect. Dorothy felt tears threatening behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who had already decided she was worth nothing. I'll go, she said simply. Good choice, Ben replied. Try the diner on 5th Street. I hear they have a senior discount. Laughter rippled from a nearby table where a group of women in their 40s had been listening to every word. One of them whispered something to her companion that Dorothy couldn't hear, but the resulting giggles made her cheeks burn with shame. Dorothy turned toward the door, each step feeling like it took tremendous effort. Behind her, she heard Ben addressing the restaurant in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards here at the Golden Palace, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions about who we serve. More murmurs of agreement from the diners. Dorothy caught fragments of their conversations as she passed. Honestly, the nerve of some people. She looked like she hadn't bathed in weeks. I don't know why they even let her through the door. Each comment was like a needle finding its mark. Dorothy had raised 3 children, taught elementary school for 37 years, and volunteered at the local food bank every Saturday since her retirement. She had held Harold's hand as cancer slowly stole him away, had sung at his funeral with a voice that barely worked through her grief, and had somehow found the strength to continue living when all she wanted was to follow him into whatever came next. But in this moment, surrounded by strangers who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience, she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. The heavy glass doors closed behind her with a soft thud that sounded like a coffin lid. The October rain had intensified, turning the world into a blur of gray and yellow streetlights. Dorothy stood under the restaurant's awning, her breath coming in short gasps as the reality of what had just happened settled over her. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, the screen cracked from when she had dropped it last month. For a moment, she considered calling her neighbor Helen, or maybe her daughter Lisa, who lived 2 states away. But they would only worry, would only feel bad for her, and Dorothy had learned long ago that pity was sometimes worse than loneliness. Instead, she scrolled to a different number. Michael's contact information glowed on the small screen, accompanied by a photo from last Christmas where he was grinning beside her kitchen table, his arm around her shoulders. Dorothy hesitated. Michael was busy, important. He had meetings and responsibilities that she couldn't even comprehend. The last thing he needed was his elderly mother calling to complain about being embarrassed at a restaurant. But the memory of Harold's face across table 1250 years ago was too strong to ignore. The way he had fumbled with the ring box, his hands shaking almost as badly as hers were shaking now. The way he had looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like she mattered more than anything else in his universe. She deserved to matter. Even at 78, even with her worn coat and modest savings, she deserved basic human dignity. Dorothy pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear, listening to it ring while the rain continued to fall around her like tears from a broken sky. Inside the Golden Palace, Ben Rodriguez straightened his tie and returned to his position at the hostess stand, completely satisfied with how he had handled the situation. He had no way of knowing that the elderly woman he had just humiliated was about to make a phone call that would change his life forever. The phone continued to ring as Dorothy waited for her son to answer, each tone carrying with it the weight of a mother's broken heart and the promise of consequences that Ben Rodriguez could never have imagined. Michael Mitchell was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed against the mahogany surface of his desk. The 45-year-old real estate mogul glanced at the caller ID and immediately set aside the financial documents that had been consuming his attention for the past 3 hours. "Mom," he answered, concern already creeping into his voice. Dorothy never called this late unless something was wrong. "Michael, honey," Dorothy's voice came through the phone, shaky and distant. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're busy." Michael leaned back in his leather chair, the city lights of downtown Chicago twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. Even at 8:30 on a Monday night, the Mitchell Development Group building hummed with activity. His empire of shopping centers, office complexes, and luxury apartment buildings required constant attention, but nothing was more important than his mother. "You're never bothering me, Mom. What's going on?" There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of rain and distant traffic. Michael could hear his mother's labored breathing, the way she was trying to compose herself. "I went to the Golden Palace tonight," Dorothy finally said, "for Dad's birthday dinner." Michael's jaw tightened. He had offered countless times to take her somewhere nicer, somewhere new, but Dorothy insisted on maintaining the tradition she had shared with his father. Every October 15th, she would dress in her best outfit and sit alone at that restaurant, ordering Harold's favorite meal and talking to his memory like he was still there across the table. "How did it go?" Michael asked, though something in his mother's tone already told him the answer. "They wouldn't let me in," Dorothy whispered, and Michael heard her voice break slightly. "The manager, he said I didn't belong there. That I should try Denny's instead." Michael's hand tightened around the phone. "What exactly did he say to you?" "It doesn't matter, sweetheart. I just needed to hear your voice." But it did matter. It mattered more than any business deal, more than any property acquisition, more than the millions of dollars that flowed through his accounts every month. Michael had built his fortune from nothing, working construction jobs through college to help support his parents when his father's teaching salary wasn't enough. Every dollar he had earned was motivated by a promise to ensure his mother never wanted for anything. "Mom, tell me exactly what happened." Dorothy's voice grew smaller as she recounted the encounter with Ben Rodriguez and Amanda Foster. She told him about the cruel laughter from other diners, about being told she looked like she was going grocery shopping, about the way they had made her feel like she was less than human. Michael's free hand slowly formed a fist on his desk. He had faced down corrupt city officials, ruthless competitors, and demanding investors without batting an eye. But hearing his mother's quiet sobs through the phone ignited a fury he hadn't felt since childhood, when bullies would tease Dorothy about her secondhand clothes at parent-teacher conferences. "Where are you now?" he asked. "I'm in my car outside the restaurant. I'll drive home in a minute. I just needed a moment." "Stay right there," Michael said, already reaching for his coat. "I'm coming to get you." "No, honey, you don't need to do that. I'm fine." But Michael was already walking toward his private elevator, his mind racing. "Mom, what's the name of that restaurant again?" "The Golden Palace." "But Michael, please don't make a fuss. I just want to forget about it. I love you, Mom. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Michael ended the call and immediately dialed his assistant's extension. Jennifer Hartwell had worked for him for 8 years and knew better than to question why her boss was calling at nearly 9 o'clock on a Monday night. "Jennifer, I need you to pull everything we have on a restaurant called the Golden Palace. Property records, lease agreements, tax filings, health inspection reports, everything. Right away, Mr. Mitchell." "Is there a particular reason?" "Someone just made a very big mistake." While Jennifer worked her magic with the company's research team, Michael made another call to his property management division. Mitchell Development Group owned dozens of commercial properties throughout the city, but he left the day-to-day management to specialized firms that handled rent collection, maintenance, and tenant relations. "Tom, it's Michael. I need you to check something for me. Do we own the building that houses a restaurant called the Golden Palace?" Tom Bradley, head of property management, was quiet for a moment while he accessed the company's database. "Let me check our commercial portfolio." "Yes, we do. It's part of the Riverside District development we acquired 2 years ago." "Why?" Michael felt a cold smile spread across his face. The Riverside District had been one of his most successful investments, a struggling area that he had transformed into an upscale dining and shopping destination. He had purchased the entire block for a fraction of its current value, renovated the historic buildings, and carefully selected tenants who would maintain the area's new prestigious reputation. "What can you tell me about their lease status?" "Hold on," Tom said, clicking through digital files. "This is interesting. The Golden Palace is 3 months behind on rent. They've been sending partial payments and excuses, claiming business has been slow. I was actually planning to start eviction proceedings next week." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of excuses?" "The usual stuff. Economic downturn, competition from chain restaurants, need more time to get back on their feet. Their lease requires full payment by the 1st of each month, but they've been paying maybe 60% and asking for extensions. Have they been honest about their financial situation?" Tom paused. "Actually, that's where it gets murky. I drove by there last weekend and the place looked packed. Cars in the parking lot, people waiting outside. Either they're lying about their revenue or they're terrible at managing money." Michael walked to his window, looking out at the city where he had built his empire one property at a time. Every building told story. Every lease represented a relationship built on mutual respect and honest dealing. He had no tolerance for tenants who lied to him or took advantage of his business practices. "Tom, I want you to prepare a full financial audit of the Golden Palace. Bank statements, tax returns, profit and loss statements, everything their lease requires them to provide. And I want it done first thing tomorrow morning. Consider it done." "Should I give him a heads up that we're coming?" "No," Michael said quietly. "Let's make it a surprise." His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. The preliminary research on the Golden Palace was already coming together, and what he saw made his blood run even colder. The restaurant had been operating under a series of health violations that had been mysteriously resolved without public documentation. Ben Rodriguez had been cited twice for discriminatory practices by previous customers, complaints that had been buried in legal paperwork and sealed settlements. Most damning of all, the Golden Palace had been advertising itself as a 5-star establishment while failing to pay the taxes and fees required to maintain that certification. Michael scrolled through complaint after complaint filed with the Better Business Bureau. Elderly customers who had been turned away for not meeting dress codes. Minority families who had been told there were no available tables despite obvious openings. Working-class couples who had been seated in corners near the kitchen and ignored by wait staff until they left. The pattern was clear and disgusting. Ben Rodriguez had built his restaurant's reputation by excluding anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable clientele. He had created an atmosphere of artificial exclusivity by systematically humiliating people who reminded his wealthy customers that the real world existed outside their bubble. Michael's driver was waiting when he reached the parking garage. As they navigated through Chicago traffic toward the Golden Palace, he made a series of phone calls that would have consequences Ben Rodriguez couldn't possibly imagine. First, he called his attorney. "David, I need you to prepare eviction papers for a commercial tenant." "Yes, I know it's late." "This is a priority." Next, he contacted the city's health inspection department. "This is Michael Mitchell. I'm calling to report suspected health code violations at the Golden Palace restaurant. I have reason to believe they've been operating without proper certification." Finally, he called a contact at the local newspaper. "Janet, this is Michael Mitchell. I have a story for you about systematic discrimination at an upscale restaurant. Are you interested?" By the time his car pulled into the Golden Palace parking lot, Michael had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel Ben Rodriguez's carefully constructed world. But first, he needed to take care of his mother. Dorothy was sitting in her old Honda Civic, staring at the rain-streaked windshield with tears streaming down her face. Michael tapped gently on her window, and when she looked up, he saw the broken expression that would fuel his anger for years to come. "Come on, Mom," he said as she rolled down the window. "Let's go home." "I'm sorry you had to come out here," Dorothy said, her voice still shaky. "I just couldn't stop crying long enough to drive." Michael helped her out of the car and into his warm BMW. As they drove away from the Golden Palace, he made one final call. "Jennifer, are you still at the office?" "Good. I want you to schedule a meeting with our property management team for 7 a.m. tomorrow. We're going to pay a visit to the Golden Palace, and I want everything documented. Should I prepare the standard eviction paperwork?" Michael looked at his mother, who had fallen asleep against the passenger window, exhausted by the emotional trauma of the evening. Her face looked older than her 78 years, worn down by the cruelty of people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. "Prepare everything," he said quietly. "By tomorrow night, Ben Rodriguez is going to understand exactly what it feels like to lose everything." As they drove through the rainy Chicago streets, Michael began planning the most satisfying business meeting of his career. Ben Rodriguez had humiliated an elderly woman for the crime of existing in his space. Tomorrow, he would learn that the elderly woman he had dismissed so casually was about to cost him everything he had worked to build. The Golden Palace would be closing permanently, and Ben Rodriguez would discover that actions have consequences, especially when you make the mistake of hurting someone whose son has the power to destroy your entire world. Michael glanced at his sleeping mother and made a silent promise. No one would ever make her feel worthless again. Not on his watch. Tuesday morning arrived with a kind of crisp October sunshine that made Chicago look deceptively peaceful. Ben Rodriguez hummed quietly to himself as he unlocked the front doors of the Golden Palace, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. At 42, Ben had grown comfortable in his role as gatekeeper to one of the city's most exclusive dining establishments. He took pride in maintaining what he called standards, though most people would have recognized his behavior as simple cruelty disguised as professionalism. Last night's encounter with the elderly woman had already faded from his memory, filed away as just another successful defense of his restaurant's reputation. Amanda Foster arrived 30 minutes later, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she prepared for another day of serving Chicago's elite. She had slept well, unburdened by any guilt over how they had treated Dorothy Mitchell. In Amanda's world, people got what they deserved, and if someone couldn't afford to eat at the Golden Palace, they had no business being there in the first place. "Good morning, Ben," Amanda called out as she adjusted the fresh orchids on table 12, the same table where Harold Mitchell had proposed to Dorothy 50 years earlier. "Ready for another busy day?" "Always," Ben replied, straightening his tie in the reflection of the hostess stand mirror. "I love maintaining the atmosphere our clientele expects." Neither of them noticed the black SUV that had been parked across the street since 6 a.m. or the second vehicle that joined it at 7:15. They were too busy preparing for a normal Tuesday to realize that normal had just ended permanently. At exactly 8 a.m., Michael Mitchell stepped out of his BMW and surveyed the Golden Palace with the calculating gaze of a man who owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ben Rodriguez made in a month, but his expression was carved from ice. Behind him, 3 members of his property management team emerged from the SUV, each carrying thick folders and official-looking documents. Tom Bradley, Jennifer Hartwell, and legal counsel David Patterson had spent the entire night compiling everything they needed to destroy Ben Rodriguez's life with the cold efficiency of a surgical strike. Remember, Michael said quietly as they approached the restaurant, this is a routine property inspection. We're here to verify lease compliance and assess the condition of our investment. Keep everything professional until I give you the signal. Michael pushed through the front doors of the Golden Palace with the confidence of a man who owned the building, which he did. The restaurant was empty except for staff preparing for the lunch service, but Ben Rodriguez immediately recognized the presence of authority when he saw it. Good morning, Ben said, plastering on his most obsequious smile. I'm afraid we don't open for lunch until 11:30, but if you'd like to make a reservation, Ben Rodriguez. Michael's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men nervous. Yes, that's me. I'm the manager here. How can I help you? Michael studied Ben's face for a long moment, memorizing every detail of the man who had made his mother cry. Ben was shorter than he had expected, with a kind of artificial confidence that came from bullying people who couldn't fight back. His expensive suit was slightly too tight, his cologne slightly too strong, his smile slightly too wide. I'm Michael Mitchell from Mitchell Development Group. We own this building. The color drained from Ben's face so quickly that Amanda Foster, who had been eavesdropping from behind the bar, actually took a step forward in concern. Ben's hands began to tremble slightly as the implications of Michael's presence became clear. Mr. Mitchell, Ben stammered, what a pleasant surprise. We weren't expecting a visit from the ownership group. No, Michael replied coldly. I imagine you weren't. Tom Bradley stepped forward with his clipboard and began a methodical inspection of the dining room, photographing everything from the condition of the carpet to the cleanliness of the silverware. Jennifer Hartwell moved toward the kitchen, her heels echoing ominously against the marble floor. David Patterson remained near the door, blocking any potential escape routes. Is there something specific you're looking for? Ben asked, sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the restaurant's air conditioning. Michael walked to table 12 and placed his hand on the white tablecloth, the same table where his father had proposed to his mother decades before either Ben Rodriguez or Amanda Foster had been born. When he looked up, his eyes held the kind of fury that successful businessmen learn to control but never truly eliminate. We're here to discuss your lease compliance, Michael said. Specifically, your failure to pay rent for the past 3 months. Ben's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind him, Amanda Foster went pale as she realized the magnitude of the situation they were facing. There's been a misunderstanding, Ben said quickly. We've been having some cash flow issues, but we've been making payments. Partial payments, but payments nonetheless. 60% of your monthly obligation, Tom Bradley called out from across the room, not looking up from his inspection checklist. For 3 consecutive months. Your lease clearly states that failure to pay full rent by the first of each month constitutes grounds for immediate eviction. Michael walked slowly around the dining room, his footsteps deliberate and measured. He paused at the table where Dorothy had been humiliated, running his fingers along the edge of the pristine white cloth. Tell me about your customer service policies, Mr. Rodriguez. Ben's confusion was evident. Our customer service policies? Yes. How do you determine who is worthy of dining at the Golden Palace? Amanda Foster stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to deflect blame. We maintain very high standards, Mr. Mitchell. Our clientele expects a certain atmosphere, a certain level of sophistication. Michael turned his attention to Amanda, and she immediately regretted speaking. His gaze was like being examined under a microscope by someone who already knew exactly what he was going to find. Sophistication, Michael repeated slowly. Is that what you call turning away elderly customers because they don't meet your dress code? Ben's face went from pale to gray. Somewhere in the back of his mind, alarm bells were beginning to ring, but he couldn't quite connect the dots between Michael's questions and the elderly woman from the previous night. We've never discriminated against anyone, Ben lied smoothly. We treat all potential customers with respect and professionalism. Is that so? Michael pulled out his phone and scrolled to a series of photographs. Then perhaps you can explain these Better Business Bureau complaints. Mrs. Helen Washington, age 73, turned away for inappropriate attire. Mr. James Peterson, 68, told there were no available tables despite visible openings. The Martinez family refused service because their children were too loud for your establishment. Each name hit Ben like a physical blow. He had thought those complaints had been buried, settled quietly with small payments and non-disclosure agreements. He had no idea that Michael Mitchell's legal team had spent the night digging through every official record associated with the Golden Palace. Those were isolated incidents, Amanda said desperately. Misunderstandings that were resolved amicably. Resolved with hush money. David Patterson interjected from his position near the door. We have documentation of at least 12 discrimination settlements in the past 2 years. Quite expensive for a restaurant that claims to be struggling financially. Michael continued his slow walk around the dining room, each step bringing him closer to the moment of revelation that would destroy Ben Rodriguez's world. Last night, Michael said quietly, an elderly woman came to this restaurant. She wanted to have dinner at table 12, the same table where her husband had proposed to her 50 years ago. It was their anniversary tradition. Ben's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The memory of Dorothy Mitchell came flooding back with crystal clarity, along with the growing realization that he had made a catastrophic mistake. This elderly woman was dressed modestly, Michael continued. She didn't wear designer clothes or expensive jewelry. She drove an old Honda Civic and carried her money in cash because she had been saving for months to afford this one special meal. Amanda Foster backed toward the kitchen, her face a mask of terror as she understood where this conversation was heading. You told this woman that she didn't belong here. Michael's voice grew harder with each word. You suggested she try Denny's instead. You humiliated her in front of your other customers, made her feel worthless and unwanted on the anniversary of the most important day of her life. Ben's legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of the hostess stand to keep from falling as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. You laughed at her $20 bills, Michael continued relentlessly. You told her that people like her don't understand the standards of a place like this. You made my 78-year-old mother cry in the rain outside your restaurant. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ben Rodriguez felt his world tilt on its axis as he realized he had just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Your mother, Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Dorothy Mitchell, Michael said, pulling out his phone to show them a picture of himself and Dorothy from last Christmas. The woman you decided wasn't good enough for your restaurant is my mother. The woman whose money you thought wasn't worth taking is the mother of the man who owns your building. Amanda Foster sank into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands. She had participated in humiliating the landlord's mother, and now their lives were over. Ben opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? What apology could undo the cruelty he had shown to an innocent elderly woman who had only wanted to honor her deceased husband's memory? Mr. Mitchell, Ben finally managed, his voice cracking with desperation. I had no idea. If I had known who she was, if you had known who she was, you would have treated her differently. Michael's voice was deadly quiet. So you admit that you judge people based on their wealth and connections rather than their basic human dignity. Tom Bradley approached with his completed inspection report. Michael, you need to see this. They've been operating without current health permits for 6 months. The kitchen ventilation system hasn't been serviced in over a year, and their liquor license expired 3 weeks ago. Michael took the report and scanned it quickly. Ben Rodriguez hadn't just been cruel to his mother. He had been running an illegal operation while lying to everyone around him. You've been serving alcohol without a license, Michael said. Operating without health permits. Lying about your financial situation to avoid paying rent. Discriminating against customers based on age, race, and economic status. The list of violations is impressive, Mr. Rodriguez. Jennifer Hartwell returned from the kitchen with her own disturbing findings. The food storage temperatures are completely wrong. There's evidence of rodent infestation that's been covered up rather than properly addressed. And staff time cards show they've been working employees off the books to avoid paying proper taxes. Michael set the reports on table 12 and looked directly at Ben Rodriguez. You built your reputation by excluding people you deemed unworthy. You created an atmosphere of artificial exclusivity by systematically humiliating anyone who reminded your wealthy customers that the real world exists outside their bubble. And worst of all, you did it while breaking multiple laws and lying to the people who trusted you. Ben fell to his knees, literally begging for mercy that wouldn't come. Please, Mr. Mitchell. I'll make it right. I'll apologize to your mother. I'll change everything. You'll apologize to my mother, Michael agreed. But first, you're going to understand exactly what it feels like to lose everything. David Patterson stepped forward with official eviction papers. Mr. Rodriguez, you are hereby notified that your lease has been terminated effective immediately. You have 24 hours to vacate these premises. Amanda Foster began to cry, finally understanding that their cruelty had consequences. "We'll lose everything," she sobbed. "Our jobs, our reputations, everything." Michael felt no sympathy for either of them. They had shown no mercy to his mother, and they would receive none in return. "The health department will be here within the hour to shut you down," Michael said. "The Liquor Control Board will be confiscating your inventory. The IRS will be investigating your tax filings. And the Better Business Bureau will be reopening every discrimination complaint you thought you had buried." Ben looked up from his knees, tears streaming down his face. "What about our employees? They didn't do anything wrong." For the first time since entering the restaurant, Michael's expression softened slightly. "Your employees will be offered positions at other establishments in my portfolio. Unlike you, I don't punish people for other people's mistakes." Michael walked toward the door, his business at the Golden Palace finally concluded. But as he reached the threshold, he turned back one final time. "Ben Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying across the now empty dining room. "You judged my mother by her appearance and treated her like she was worthless. Now you know how it feels to lose everything in an instant. The difference is she didn't deserve what you did to her. You deserve everything that's about to happen to you." As Michael and his team left the Golden Palace for the last time, Ben Rodriguez remained on his knees in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by the ruins of the life he had built on cruelty and arrogance. By evening, the restaurant would be empty, its doors locked forever. Dorothy Mitchell would never know the full extent of what her son had done to avenge her humiliation. She would only know that sometimes, when the world seems determined to make you feel small, justice arrives in unexpected ways through the love of someone who refuses to let you suffer alone. The Golden Palace closed permanently that afternoon, and Ben Rodriguez learned that in the real world, actions have consequences, especially when you make the mistake of hurting someone whose son has the power to destroy everything you've worked to build.